Thank you very much, Ian. It's a great privilege to be here this evening, and I have indeed been fortunate to know and admire Hans and Marit Rausing for more than 20 years and receive their generous hospitality at Wadhurst, which is where they are there. And I'm reminded that whenever I visit the fine building in Cambridge's maths department that they donated, where Stephen Hawking's group studies the universe. And cosmology is one of Hans's special interests. In fact, I recall the first time we met, he asked about dark matter. He said he thought it could be black holes, the remnants of big stars that lived and died early in cosmic history. I was amazed at his suggestion, which was an idea that I was just thinking about at that time. And I was astonished at his interest and his insight. And indeed, over the ensuing 20-plus years, I've had the privilege of having many conversations and exchanging dozens of letters with Hans about the universe. But Hans is primarily an engineer and not a scientist. And I remember showing him a cartoon which all engineers like. It shows two beavers looking up at a big hydroelectric dam. One beaver is saying to the other, "I didn't actually build it, but it's based on my idea." Yeah. And that indeed reflects the balance of effort in most of science, because I'm an astronomer, an armchair theorist, but 95% of what we've achieved is due to clever engineers and clever instruments. But of course, Hans is a man who wants not only to understand the world, but to improve it. And that's what he's done through his businesses, especially in the developing world. So I've decided to talk this evening in broad terms about our global future. But I do this diffidently, especially looking towards 2050 and beyond, because I'm not an astrologer. In fact, a few years ago, I met a well-known Indian tycoon. And when he heard I had the title Astronomer Royal, he said, "Do you do the Queen's horoscopes?" And I responded with a straight face, "Well, if she wanted one, I'm the person she'd ask." And he then seemed eager to hear my predictions. I told him stocks would fluctuate, there'd be trouble in the Middle East and other similar things. And he paid rapt attention. But I then came clean and I said, "Well, I'm just an astronomer." And he then lost all interest in my predictions. And rightly so, because scientists are rotten forecasters, almost as bad as economists. And for the historians, nor do politicians and lawyers have a surer touch. And one rather surprising futurologist was Lord Birkenhead, crony of Churchill and the Lord Chancellor in the 1920s. He wrote a book called The World in 2030. This is a book, it's a collector's item because of the modernist illustrations in it. Well, he'd read Wells and Bernal. He envisaged babies incubated in flasks, flying cars, and such like fantasies. But in contrast, he foresaw social stagnation. I'll give you just one quote. "In 2030, women will still, by their wit and charms, inspire the most able men towards heights they could never themselves achieve." Well, enough said. Well, I'm going to therefore make forecasts very tentatively. This century is special. Astronomers think in billions of years, but even in that perspective, this century is very special. Earth's existed for 45 million centuries, humans for a few thousand centuries, technology for a few tens of centuries. But this century is the first when one species, ours, is so empowered that it has the planet's future in its hands. We're deep in an era that's called the Anthropocene. We have huge powers for good, but we could irreversibly degrade the biosphere, or misdirected technology, bio or cyber, could cause a catastrophic setback to civilization. 14 years ago, I wrote a book on this theme, which I called Our Final Century, Question mark. The publishers left out the question mark. And the American publishers changed the title to Our Final Hour. Americans like instant gratification and the reverse. Well, I didn't think we'd wipe ourselves out, but I did think we'd be lucky to have a century without devastating setbacks. And we've had one lucky escape already. At any time in the Cold War era, when armaments escalated beyond all reason, superpowers could have stumbled towards Armageddon through muddle or miscalculation. Now, nuclear weapons are based on 20th century science, and I'll focus later in my talk on 21st century science, bio, cyber, and AI, which offer huge potential benefits, but also lead to novel vulnerabilities. But before that, let's focus on the long-term challenges that stem not from conscious decisions, but from humanity's ever heavier collective footprint. And even with a cloudy crystal ball, there are some things we can predict with confidence. For instance, it's almost inevitable that by mid-century, the world will be more crowded. This distorted picture shows each country scaled by the amount its population has increased in the last 30 years. And the increase has been very fast. 50 years ago, world population was about 3 billion. It now exceeds 7 billion. And the growth has been mainly in Asia and in Africa, as this diagram shows. But the number of births per year worldwide actually peaked a few years ago and is going down. Nonetheless, world population is forecast to rise to about 9 billion by 2050. That's partly because most people in the developing world are young. They're yet to have children and they'll live longer. So the age histogram in the developing world, which is now the one on the left, lots of young people, very few old ones, will become like that on the right, the European one, when there's equal numbers of people in every decade up to their 70s. The main growth is in East Asia, and it's there that the world's human and financial resources will become concentrated, ending 4 centuries of North Atlantic hegemony. And there's more urbanization, that's another prediction. Even by 2030, Lagos, Sao Paulo, and Delhi will have populations each above 30 million. And to prevent these megacities becoming turbulent dystopias will surely be a major challenge to governance. Well, can the Earth carry 9 billion people? I think there's no need for gloom or panic on this front. Experts aver that improved agriculture, low-till water conserving, and perhaps involving GM crops could feed that number by mid-century. The buzzword is sustainable intensification. But lifestyle changes will be needed. The world couldn't sustain even its present population if everyone lived like Americans do today, using as much energy and eating as much beef. So this is the situation up to 2050. But beyond 2050, things are harder to predict because they will depend on what people as yet unborn decide about the number and spacing of their children. We don't know which of those graphs beyond 2050 is the most likely one. Enhanced education and empowerment of women, surely a benign priority in itself, is going to reduce fertility rates. But the demographic transition hasn't yet reached parts of India nor sub-Saharan Africa. And if families in Africa remain large, then according to the UN projections, that continent's population could double again between 2050 and 2100, reaching 4 billion. And Nigeria alone would then have a population equal to that of Europe and North America combined, and almost half the world's children would be in Africa. Well, optimists remind us that every extra mouth brings also 2 hands and a brain. Nonetheless, the higher the population becomes, the greater will be all pressures on resources, and the harder it will be for Africa to escape the poverty trap. So we must surely hope that the global figure declines rather than rises after 2050, the bottom of those three curves. Moreover, if humanity's collective impact on nature pushes too hard against what the Swedish scientist Johan Rockström calls planetary boundaries, then we shall have a possible ecological shock which could irreversibly impoverish our biosphere. Extinction rates are already rising. We're destroying the book of life before we've read it. Biodiversity is crucial to human well-being. We're clearly harmed if fish stocks dwindle to extinction. There are plants in the rainforest whose gene pool could be useful to us. But for many environmentalists, preserving the richness of our biosphere has value in its own right, over and above what that means to us humans. Indeed, the papal encyclical 2 years ago, for the first time, said that the Church took that seriously, and to quote a secular sage, the great ecologist E.O. Wilson said, "Mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for." So the world's getting more crowded. And the second firm prediction, it will gradually get warmer. Now, in contrast to population issues, climate change is certainly not under-discussed, though it may be under-acted upon. The famous Keeling curve shows the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air and how it's rising, mainly due to the burning of fossil fuels. The seasonal oscillations, incidentally, occur because there's more vegetation in the northern than the southern hemisphere, and so when the leaves fall off the trees, that boosts the carbon in the autumn, goes down again in the spring. But the overall rise is unambiguous. And the fifth IPCC report presented temperature projections for different assumptions about future rates of fossil fuel use. And these four projections, they are for different assumptions about the amount of fuel we'll go on using. But for each of these assumptions, there's a spread. The bars on the right indicate for each of the lines what the actual spread is, which is due to uncertainty in the modeling. We know what carbon dioxide itself does to produce a greenhouse effect, but we don't know the extent to which it's amplified by feedback effects, changes in water vapor and changes in clouds. This is a so-called sensitivity factor. But despite these uncertainties, the science tells us that under business as usual scenarios, we can't rule out, by 2100, really catastrophic warming and tipping points triggering long-term trends like the melting of Greenland's ice cap. Sadly, some people deny this, but even among those who accept that this threat is real, and nearly everyone does now, I think, there's a range of views. And these stem from differences in economics and ethics, in particular in how much obligation we should feel towards future generations. Some of you may know the Born-Lomborg Copenhagen consensus of economists. He applies commercial-style discounting to the future, and therefore, in effect, writes off what happens beyond 2050. So, unsurprisingly, he downplays the priority of doing anything about climate change in comparison with shorter-term efforts to help the world's poor. But if you care about those who live into the 22nd century and beyond, then, as other economists like Stern here and Weizmann at Harvard argue, you would deem it worth paying an insurance premium now to protect those generations against a possible worst-case scenario. So even those who agree that there's a significant risk of climate catastrophe a century hence will differ in how urgently they advocate action today. Their assessment will depend on expectations of future growth and optimism about technological fixes. But above all, it depends on an ethical issue. In optimizing people's life chances, should we discriminate on grounds of date of birth? As a parenthesis, I'd note that there's one policy context where an essentially zero discount rate is applied, and that's to radioactive waste disposal, where the depositories are required to prevent leakage for 10,000 years. And it's ironic that we have that policy when we can't properly plan energy policy even 30 years ahead. Consider this analogy. Suppose astronomers had tracked an asteroid and calculated it would hit the Earth in, say, 2080, 63 years from now, not with certainty, but with 10% probability. Would we relax, saying it's a problem that can be set on one side for 50 years, because people will then be richer, and it may miss us anyway? I don't think we would. There would surely be a consensus that we should then start straight away and do our damnedest to find ways to deflect it or mitigate its effects. Many still hope that our civilization can segue smoothly towards a low-carbon future. The pledges made at the Paris conference were a positive step. But even if they're honoured, this may not happen fast enough to prevent CO2 concentrations rising to dangerous levels. But there is one measure to mitigate climate change which seems a win-win situation. It doesn't require any self-denial or hardship. It's that nations should accelerate R&D into all forms of low-carbon energy generation. Renewables, fourth-generation nuclear, fusion and the rest. And also into other technologies where parallel progress is needed, especially energy storage, batteries, compressed air, pumped storage, flywheels, etc., and smart grids. That's why an encouraging outcome of the Paris conference was an initiative called Mission Innovation, endorsed by more than 20 nations, which was a campaign to double publicly funded R&D into clean energy by 2020. And has been a parallel pledge by Bill Gates and private philanthropists to do the same. That's important because the faster these clean technologies advance, the sooner will their prices fall, so that they become affordable to developing countries where more generating capacity is needed. For instance, in India, where the health of the poor is jeopardized now by smoky stoves burning wood or dung, and where they need more energy and there'll be pressure to build coal-fired power stations unless they can afford a cleaner alternative. And it would be hard to think of a more inspiring challenge for young engineers than to develop clean and affordable energy for the world, especially the developing world. But if this transition fails, and if, say, 20 years from now, it's clear that we are on a sharply rising trajectory, if it's clear that by then the so-called climate sensitivity is high, so the temperature is rising into dangerous levels, there might then be pressure for panic measures, such as what's called geoengineering. This is a plan B, where you're fatalistic about continuing dependence on fossil fuels, but you combat the effects of the greenhouse warming by either a massive investment in carbon capture and storage or else by geoengineering. It's feasible, for instance, to inject enough aerosols into the stratosphere to cool the world's climate. Indeed, what's scary is that this might be within the resources of a single nation or even a single corporation. And there could be unintended side effects. Moreover, the warming would return with a vengeance if these countermeasures were discontinued, and other consequences of rising CO2, especially the effect of ocean acidification, would be unchecked. Geoengineering would be a political nightmare. Not all nations would want to adjust the thermostat the same way. Very elaborate climatic modeling would be needed in order to calculate the regional impacts of any artificial intervention on large-scale weather patterns. Indeed, the only beneficiaries would be the lawyers. They'd have a bonanza if nations could litigate over bad weather. Nonetheless, I think it's prudent to explore geoengineering techniques enough to clarify which options make sense and perhaps damp down undue optimism about a quick fix for our climate. I think we should be evangelists for new technologies. Without them, the world certainly can't provide food and sustainable energy for the expanding and more demanding population that's going to come. But we need wisely directed technology. Advanced renewables, I think, are wise goals. Geoengineering techniques probably aren't. But what about the other technologies that pervade our lives? Can we cope with their headlong advance? This is my next topic. We're getting more vulnerable. Our increasingly interconnected world depends on elaborate networks. Electric power grids, air traffic control, international finance, globally dispersed manufacturing, and so forth. And unless these networks are highly resilient, their benefits could be outweighed by catastrophic, albeit rare, breakdowns. Cities will be paralyzed without electricity. Air travel can spread a pandemic worldwide within days. Advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics are exciting. They offer prospects of containing pandemics as many as other benefits. But that same research has controversial aspects. For instance, in 2012, groups in Wisconsin and in Holland were studying the influenza virus and showed it was surprisingly easy to make it both more virulent and more transmissible. They want to stay one step ahead of nature to understand it better. But to some, this was a scary portent of things to come. And indeed, in 2014, the US federal government decided to cease funding these so-called gain-of-function experiments on viruses. And the new CRISPR-Cas9 technique for gene editing is hugely promising, but again, there are ethical concerns based by the Chinese experiments already done on human embryos, for instance. And gene drive programs, where you try to wipe out a whole species by gene modification, are going to be feasible too. There are attempts to wipe out the mosquito that carries the Zika virus. Also, some lovers of brown squirrels have pointed out you could eliminate the grey ones by this technique. But disturbing natural ecologies clearly risks unintended consequences. Back in the early days of recombinant DNA research, the 1970s, leading biologists met in Asilomar, California, and they agreed guidelines on what experiments should and shouldn't be done. This seemingly encouraging precedent has motivated several recent meetings to discuss these new developments in the same spirit. But today, 40 years after Asilomar, the research community is far more broadly international, more under commercial pressure too. And I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed on prudential or ethical grounds, they can't be enforced worldwide any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws can. Whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. And that's a nightmare. An atomic bomb can't be built without large-scale special facilities, but biotech involves small-scale, dual-use equipment. Indeed, biohacking is burgeoning even as a hobby and competitive game. And we know all too well that technical expertise doesn't guarantee balanced rationality. The global village will have its village idiots, and they'll have global rage. The rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups, or even individuals, empowered by bio as well as cyber technology, will pose an intractable challenge to governments and aggravate the tension between freedom, privacy, and security, even more than the concerns we have now. Looking now beyond 2050, things are more uncertain. In my view, concerns about bioerror and bioerror are quite near-term, within the next 10 or 20 years. But if we look further ahead, we can't be so sure, because after all, the smartphone, the web, and their ancillaries would have seemed magic even 20 years ago. So looking several decades ahead, we must keep our minds open, or at least ajar, to innovations that might now seem science fiction. On the bio front, the great physicist Freeman Dyson conjectures a time when children will be able to design and create new organisms just as his generation played with chemistry sets. Well, if it really becomes possible to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, our ecology and even our species may not long survive unscathed. So let's hope that's not possible. But what about another transformative technology? Robotics and artificial intelligence, AI. There's been exciting advances in what's called generalized machine learning. The London-based company DeepMind last year achieved a remarkable feat. Its computer beat the world champion in the Chinese game of Go. There's the world champion looking a bit bewildered. And Carnegie Mellon University has developed a machine that can bluff and calculate as well as the best human poker players. Well, you may say this doesn't sound a very big deal because it's 20 years since IBM's Deep Blue beat Kasparov, the world chess champion. But the machine that played Kasparov was programmed by expert players. In contrast, the machines that play Go and poker, they gain expertise by absorbing a huge number of games and playing against themselves. Their designers don't themselves know how the Go-playing machine decided to make some, as it turned out, specially insightful moves. The speed of computers, which is growing according to the famous diagram here, allows computers to succeed by brute force methods. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images, not the way babies learn. And they learn to translate by reading millions of pages of, for example, multilingual EU documents. They never get bored. But advances are patchy. Robots are still clumsier than a child in moving pieces on a real chessboard. They can't tie your shoelaces or cut old people's toenails. But sensor technology, speech recognition, information searches, and so on are advancing apace. And the machines won't just take over manual work. Indeed, plumbing and gardening will be among the hardest jobs to automate. But they will take over routine legal work, medical diagnostics, and even surgery. The big social and economic question is this: will this second machine age be like earlier disruptive technologies, like when the car replaced the horse, and create as many jobs as it destroys? Or is it really different this time? This, as I'm sure you know, is a matter of lively debate. It's clear that the money earned by robots could generate huge wealth for an elite. But to preserve a healthy society will then require massive redistribution to ensure that everyone has at least a living wage. And moreover, I think not just a living wage as a handout, but by the creation and upgrading of public service jobs where the human element is crucial and is now undervalued and where demand is huge, especially carers for young and carers for old people, but also custodians, gardeners in public parks, and so on. So massive redistribution and dignified, secure public service jobs in huge numbers. That, I think, is going to be what we need. But let's look further ahead. How human-like will these machines be in the long run? If they could observe and interpret their environment as adeptly as we do, they would then truly be perceived as intelligent beings to which or to whom we can relate. Such machines pervade popular culture in movies like Her, Transcendence, and Ex Machina. So would we then have obligations towards them? We worry if our fellow humans and even some animals can't fulfill their natural potential. So should we then feel guilty if our robots are underemployed or bored? And what if a machine develops a mind of its own? Would it stay docile or go rogue? If it could infiltrate the internet and the Internet of Things, it could manipulate the rest of the world. And it may have goals utterly orthogonal to human wishes or even treat humans as an encumbrance. Well, some AI pundits take these concerns seriously and they think that their field already needs guidelines, just as biotech does. But I should say there are others who regard these concerns as still premature and worry less about artificial intelligence than about real stupidity, and think that'll be the situation for a few more decades. But be that as it may, I think it's likely that society is going to be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury's out on whether they will be idiot savants or display superhuman capabilities. There's disagreement too, incidentally, about the route towards human-level intelligence. Some think we should emulate nature and reverse engineer the human brain. Others say that's as misguided as designing flying machines by copying how birds flap their wings. And of course, philosophers debate whether consciousness is special to the wet organic brains of humans, apes, and dogs, so that robots, even if they're intellectually superhuman, will still lack self-awareness or inner life. Or is consciousness an emergent property, which they'd have too? The futurologist Ray Kurzweil, here he is, now works for Google. And he argues that once machines have surpassed human capabilities, they will then assemble a new generation of even more powerful ones, an intelligence explosion, what's called a singularity. He thinks humans could transcend biology by merging with computers. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they would go over to the other side. But Kurzweil's worried this may not happen in his lifetime. He's in his 60s. So he wants his body frozen until this nirvana is reached. I was once interviewed by a group of these cryonic enthusiasts based in California, a group that called itself the Society for the Abolition of Involuntary Death. They will, via a company in Arizona, freeze your body so that when immortality is on offer, you can be resurrected or your brain downloaded. And I told these people I'd rather end my days in an English churchyard than in a Californian refrigerator. And they derided me as a deathist, very old-fashioned. But I was surprised to find that 3 academics in this country had gone in for cryonics. 2 had paid the full whack. The third had taken the cut-price option of having just his head frozen. But I'm glad to say that they were from Oxford and not from Cambridge. But of course, more seriously, research on aging is being prioritized. We don't know if the benefits will be incremental or is aging a disease that can be cured. Dramatic life extension will clearly be a wild card in the population projections I gave earlier, with huge ramifications. But it may happen along with human enhancement in other forms. And now a digression into my special interest and Hans Rausing's, space, because this is where robots will surely be transformative. During this century, the whole solar system will be explored by flotillas of miniaturized probes, far more advanced than the robot that ESA's Rosetta landed on a comet, or NASA's New Horizon probe that transmitted amazing pictures from Pluto 10,000 times further away than the moon. These 2 instruments took 10 years on their journey and 5 years in the planning stage. Think how much better we could do now if you think how smartphones have evolved in 15 years. And the amazing Cassini probe of Saturn is even more of an antique. It was launched just over 20 years ago. Think how much better we can do. And better, too, than the Curiosity robot, which is now trundling over the surface of Mars. Later this century, I think giant robotic fabricators may assemble vast, lightweight structures in space. Gossamer thin radio reflectors, or solar energy collectors, for instance, maybe using raw materials mined from the moon or from asteroids. But what about human spaceflight? Robotic and AI advances are actually making humans less necessary, less value-added than in the past. Nonetheless, I do hope that people will follow the robots, though it will be as risk-seeking adventurers rather than for practical goals. The most promising developments here are spearheaded by private companies. Elon Musk's SpaceX company has launched unmanned payloads and docked with a space station, and it successfully recovered and reused the launch rocket's first stage, presenting real cost savings. And Musk hopes soon to offer orbital flights to paying customers. And beyond that, wealthy adventurers are signing up for a week-long trip round the far side of the moon and back, going further from Earth than any humans have been before. I'm told they've sold a ticket for the second flight, but not the first flight, so maybe that tells you something. Well, we should surely acclaim these private enterprise efforts in space, because they can tolerate higher risks than a Western government could impose on publicly funded civilian astronauts. They can thereby cut costs compared to NASA or ESA. But they should be promoted as adventures or extreme sports. The phrase space tourism should be avoided because it lulls people into unrealistic confidence. But I think that by 2100, not by 2050 perhaps, courageous pioneers in the mold of, say, Felix Baumgartner, he's the guy who fell supersonically from a high-altitude balloon, or our own Sir Ranulph Fiennes, who's done all kinds of crazy things, dragging a sledge across the Antarctic in winter and things like that. People like that will have established bases independent from the Earth, on Mars or maybe on asteroids. And Musk himself says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And he's 45, so 40 years from now, he may indeed take the one-way trip. But don't ever expect mass emigration from Earth, because no way in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. It's a dangerous delusion to think that space offers an escape from Earth's problems. There's no planet B. Indeed, space is an inherently hostile environment for humans. And for that reason, even though we may wish to regulate genetic and cyborg technology on Earth, for the reasons I've discussed, we should surely wish these space pioneers, these crazy adventurers, good luck in using all such techniques, and they'll be very advanced by 2100, to adapt to alien conditions. They'll be free from terrestrial regulations, and they'll have maximal incentive to do so, because they are going to need to adapt. And indeed, these spacefarers may then spearhead the beginning of the post-human era, evolving within a few centuries into a new species, whether some sort of cyborg or whether it's entirely electronic, we don't know. And that's just the beginning. As an astronomer, I'm sometimes asked, does contemplation of huge expanses of space and time affect your everyday life? Well, having spent much of my life among astronomers, I have to say that they're not especially serene. They fret just as much as anyone about what happens next week or tomorrow. But they do have one special perspective, and that's an awareness of a long-term future. So let me explain this. The stupendous time spans of the evolutionary past are now part of common culture, outside fundamentalist circles in Kentucky or the Muslim world. But most people who accept what's crudely depicted here, this time chart, tend to regard humans as a culmination of the evolutionary tree. And that's something no astronomers could do, because we know that our sun formed 4.5 billion years ago, but we also know it's got 6 billion more years before its fuel runs out. And the expanding universe will continue even longer, perhaps forever. And to quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So we may not even be at the halfway stage of evolution. So it may take decades to develop human-level AI. It may take a few centuries. But be that as it may, that's but an instant compared to the cosmic future stretching ahead. And that future will be probably inorganic rather than organic. because although the Earth's environment may suit us, interplanetary and interstellar space may be the preferred arena where robots will have the grander scope for construction and where non-biological brains may develop powers that humans can't even imagine. Well, this raises the question which astronomers are most often asked. Is there life out there already? Or is the galaxy out there waiting for our post-human progeny to get there? Well, we know that there's no way in our solar system that harbors advanced life. There'll be no H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds from Mars, but there could be some freeze-dried bacteria on the red planet, and there may be creatures swimming under the ice on Saturn's moon Enceladus. But let's now widen our horizons from our solar system to the realm of the stars. And here we've had exciting developments in the last decade. We've learned that most stars in the sky are orbited by retinues of planets, just like the Sun is. The evidence, however, is still mainly indirect. We can't see the planets, but we can infer them because we can detect the slight dimming of the star if a planet transits across in front of it, or the slight wobble in a star due to the gravity of a planet orbiting it. So we can infer the sizes and orbits of these planets. And we can infer that they are indeed very common. And two important things have been inferred, roughly speaking, that almost every star has at least one planet around it, and 1 in every 6 stars has an Earth-sized planet around it. These are very rough numbers. But that just means that there are millions of these planets in our galaxy. And indeed, there's an Earth-like planet orbiting the nearest star, Proxima Centauri. And there was a remarkable discovery just a few months ago that a very faint star, I won't explain why it's got the acronym TRAPPIST, but it's a very faint star, which is about 1/10 the mass of the Sun and 1% the brightness of the Sun, a very faint red star, has 7 planets orbiting around it. And it's a miniature solar system, because those planets are orbiting around, and their years last just a few days there, so it's a very small planet. And the outer 3 of these planets are in the habitable zone, in the sense that they've got a temperature such as water would neither boil away nor stay frozen. So they could indeed be habited. And if you lived, this is Arthur's impression, of course, but they're very unearthly, and they'd be spectacular places to live, because viewed from the surface of one of the planets, you'd see the other planets zooming by in the sky, looking as big as our moon does in the sky. So it'd be very exciting. And another thing is that these planets, because they're close to their star, they're tidally locked, so they present their same face to the star, just as the moon presents its same face to the Earth. So one half will be always in sunlight, one half in darkness. So there'll be sort of apartheid, everyone living in the light half, except for the astronomers who'd all be in the other half. Yeah. Yes. Well, we've inferred these planets, but what we'd really like to do is to actually detect them and image them, not just see their shadows, as it were. But that's hard. To imagine how hard, let's suppose that an alien astronomer with a powerful telescope was looking at our Earth from, say, 30 light years away, the distance of a nearby star. Our planet would seem, in Carl Sagan's nice phrase, a pale blue dot, very close in the sky to its star, our Sun, which outshines it by many billions. A firefly next to a searchlight, as it were. But if the aliens had a big enough telescope they could detect this pale blue dot, they could learn something about it, because the shade of blue would be slightly different depending on whether the Pacific Ocean or the landmass of Asia was facing them. So they could infer there were continents and oceans, the length of the day, and by analyzing the light, something about the atmosphere and perhaps evidence of non-equilibrium and of life. Well, we can't do that yet, but the next generation of telescopes will be able to. And the European Southern Observatory, this is a consortium that the UK belongs to. Unfortunately, it's not part of the EU, so we can stay in this. This is building the world's biggest telescope, which is going to be in Chile. They've started construction. They're not very imaginative in their nomenclature. It's called the Extremely Large Telescope, the ELT. And it's got a mirror 39 meters across. That, I would guess, is probably about 3 times the width of this lecture theatre. A mosaic of 800 pieces of glass. And instruments like that will be able, in 10 years' time, to draw inferences about these other Earths, rather like the inferences my imaginary alien drew about the Earth. Well, there are many planets which are habitable. That doesn't mean inhabited. But for most of us, that's the number one question. We still don't know the likelihood that they're inhabited because we know too little about how life began on the Earth. We don't know what triggered the transition from complex molecules to entities that can metabolize and reproduce. It might have involved a fluke so rare it happened only once in our galaxy. On the other hand, this crucial transition might have been almost inevitable given the right environment. We just don't know. Nor do we know if the DNA, RNA chemistry of terrestrial life is the only possibility, or just one chemical basis among many options which could be realized elsewhere. Moreover, even if simple life is widespread, we can't assess the odds that it evolves into a complex biosphere. And even if it did, it might be unrecognizably different. For instance, life around a star older than the Sun could have had a head start of 1 billion years or more. Thus, it might already have spawned the futuristic scenario, transitioning from organic to electronic, which I imagined as our Earth's post-human future. So even if these so-called SETI searches, looking for some artificial emission, find something, we'd be most unlikely to catch an alien intelligence in the brief sliver of time when it's still in organic form. So I think if we were to detect something artificial, it's less likely to be a decodable message than to be a byproduct or malfunction of some super complex interstellar technology which could trace its lineage back to alien organic beings which might still exist on a home planet or might long ago have died out. Well, I've agreed to chair an intensive search for radio and optical signals of this kind, an expanded SETI search, which is a 10-year program bankrolled by Yuri Milner, a Russian billionaire investor. It's a high-risk thing, but far better he should spend his money this way than on a yacht or a football team, in my opinion. Well, I won't hold my breath, but these SETI programs are a worthwhile gamble because success in the search would carry the momentous message that concepts of logic and physics aren't limited to the hardware in human skulls. Well, I've got no time to speculate further beyond this flaky fringe, perhaps a good thing, so let me conclude by focusing back closer to the here and now. My theme has been, in the main part of this talk, that even in the concertina timeline that astronomers envisage, extending billions of years into the future as well as into the past, this century may be a defining era. A century where humans jumpstart the transition to electronic and potentially immortal entities which spread far beyond the Earth, or, to take the darker view, the century where our follies could foreclose that immense future potential. We fret unduly about small risks, air crashes, carcinogens in food, low radiation doses, etc. But we're in denial about some newly emergent threats, which may seem improbable, but whose consequences could be globally devastating. Some of these are environmental, others are potential downsides of novel technology, and I've alluded to them earlier. So how can those of us concerned about these issues influence policymakers? The trouble is, of course, that even the best politicians focus mainly on the urgent and parochial and getting re-elected. This is an endemic frustration for those who've been official scientific advisors to government. To attract politicians' attention, you must get headlines in the press and fill their inboxes. So scientists can have more leverage indirectly by campaigning so that a wide public share their concerns and the media amplify their voice. So we need more focus on these long-term issues, which are long-term in the political perspective, even for a mere instant in the history of our planet. And that's something which universities can do and museums can do. because they're full of young people who live to the end of the century. Moreover, universities can use their convening power to gather experts together to address these problems. And that's why some of us in Cambridge have set up a Centre for the Study of Extreme Risks with a focus on these more extreme, low probability, high consequence threats. These surely deserve expert analysis to assess which can be dismissed firmly as science fiction and which should be on the risk register, and to consider how to establish more resilience against the more credible ones. Even if we manage to reduce these risks by a tiny percentage, the stakes are so high that groups like ours will have earned their keep. It's a wise mantra that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. These new threats have never happened before. That doesn't mean we could ignore them. But though we live under the shadow of these threats, and may be political pessimists, we must remain techno-optimists. Advances in AI, biotech, nanotech, and space can boost the developing and the developed world. Indeed, if we don't responsibly progress these new technologies, we won't achieve a bright vision at all. Undiluted application of the precautionary principle has a manifest downside. We're all on this crowded world together. Spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support system is vulnerable to disruption and breakdowns. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning, too little awareness of long-term risks. And I want to conclude with some words from two scientific sages. First, H.G. Wells, who had his education at the School of Mines just down the road from here, and back in 1902, he gave a famous lecture at the Royal Institution. I'll give you two quotes from it. He was alert to the risk of global disaster. And he said this, he said, "It's impossible to show why certain things should not utterly destroy and end the human story and make our efforts vain. Something from space or pestilence or some great disease of the atmosphere or new animals to prey on us or some drug or wrecking madness in the mind of man." But nonetheless, he retained a vision. I quote again, "Humanity has come some way, and the distance we have traveled gives us some earnest of the way we have to go. All the past is but the beginning of a beginning. All that the human mind has accomplished is but the dream before the awakening." Well, this rather purple prose still resonates a century later. And were Wells writing today, he would have been elated by an expanding vision of life in the cosmos, but he'd have been, I think, even more anxious about the perils that we might face. The stakes are higher. And he reflects the mix of optimism and anxiety and of speculation and science, which I've tried to offer in this lecture. But we mustn't leap from denial to despair, so I give the very last word to another scientific sage, the eloquent biologist Peter Medawar. Again, I quote, "The bells that toll for mankind are like the bells of alpine cattle. They are attached to our own necks, and it must be our fault if they don't make a tuneful and melodious sound." And I think Hans Rousing would have thought that too. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Martin. As that applause indicates, you've given us a wonderful panoramic view of the cosmos, the world, and everything. Occasionally dystopian, but I think ultimately hopeful. And nobody could have done it better than you. Not only is Martin one of the world's most distinguished scientists, he is one of the world's most distinguished communicators of science, and I think we have seen a bravura performance in that respect this evening. Moreover, of course, you're a very old friend of this museum. As Ian said, you were a trustee and you're now a member of the Science Foundation, which does wonderful work in supporting the museum. You're moreover an old friend and scientific correspondent of Hans Rousing, and it's been such a pleasure to have the Rousing family with us, and it's my pleasure to add my thanks to that of Ian, to you, Hans Christian, and your family for the generous impulse that has turned this extremely unlovely lecture that Ian underestimated, really, the impact of it when I was a new chairman. into this elegant space that is not only appropriate for this highly sophisticated audience, but can withstand the onslaught of a room full of 8-year-olds. So Martin, thank you once again. A wonderful trip around the universe. Would you be so kind as to take a couple of questions before we let you go? I'm sure there will be many. Please.
You alluded to the short-termism of politics.
Yes.
And I wondered whether you had any thoughts on how we could arrange our affairs as intelligent human beings so as not to be subject to such short-termism.
Well, I mean, I think politicians respond to voters and voters short-term. But I would like to make one remark, which is that I think religion has a role. And although I'm not religious at all, I'm on the council of the Papal Academy of Science. And a conference which that academy organised in 2014 on sustainability and climate change got the world's best scientists, plus economists like Jeffrey Sachs and Stiglitz. And that was an important input into the papal encyclical the following year, which in turn had a big effect in Latin America, Africa and East Asia, and the Pope got a standing ovation at the UN, and that had a big effect, I think, on forging the consensus in Paris. Because whatever you think of the Catholic Church, no one can deny its long-term view. It's concern for the world's poor, and those are crucial here. And so I think that if individuals are inspired by some long-term vision and they are made to care about the value of the planet as being something which is valuable in its own right, and realise that the environment that they leave to their grandchildren should be at least as good as the one we have now, in the words of the famous Brundtland report, that we should leave a planet that's in as good a state as we found it, then I think they will put pressure on politicians. So I think it's got to come from the public, and that's why I think that we as scientists obviously have to address politicians, but I think by addressing the public and helping mass movements, including religions and others, to raise public consciousness and awareness of the threats and opportunities, then we can, I hope, move things forward. Yes, sir.
You've said that if we're looking up from this, from another star,
yes,
you'd see this faint blue planet that is the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Surely one thing that would make it stand out would be the radioactivity, even if it was just Trump's tweets. Now, if you were looking at, looking for life elsewhere, surely that would be one of the things, not necessarily looking for water, but looking for radioactivity
yes.
in a faraway star.
Yes. Well, I mean, the biosphere, I was thinking of something that might not have intelligent life, but just evidence of any kind of life which would affect the biosphere, because we would suspect that life of some kind is much more common than any kind of technological life, for two reasons. First, that technological life may be short-lived, but secondly, many possibilities are that evolution doesn't get that far. I mean, biologists think that perhaps if the dinosaurs had been wiped out, for instance, we wouldn't have any humans. It might be different. So what I was talking about is any kind of life. But I agree that as far as looking for technological civilization, then radio is the best. In fact, the strongest radio signals from the Earth are, in fact, the anti-nuclear radar, things like that. They would be the strongest things. And so it is true that we are looking, when we look for evidence of extraterrestrial civilization, we are looking for some sort of radio emission which could not be natural. And so you're quite right in saying that would be indication of something that was not natural and not just an ordinary biosphere. But I think I should have said that even the optimists who are involved in these searches would say there's only a few % chance of success. But nonetheless, the stakes are so high that it's worth spending $10 million a year worldwide. I think if you were to ask people to come out of a science fiction movie, would they be happy if the tax in that movie were hypothecated for this kind of search? Enough would say yes, that one wouldn't feel guilty at publicly funding it. But in fact, all this effort has been funded by private philanthropists. Of course, I should say, going back to being an astronomer royal, I get lots of letters from people who think they know the answer. Because they've been visited or they've been abducted or something. When I get these letters, I do two things. I first write back saying, do they really think that the aliens, having made this huge effort to cross interstellar space, would they just make a corn circle, meet a well-known crank and go away again? And then I tell them to write to each other, not to me.
One of them must be the chap who introduced Martin Ryle years ago on local radio as Professor of Radio Astrology.
Oh, yes, gentleman there, yes.
We live in an age where we have increasing amounts of electromagnetic radiation all around us, from cell phones and radio, etc. And there is a school of thought that says we should use a large amount of tinfoil, essentially, to shield ourselves, wear tinfoil helmets and sort of cover the walls. Do you think there is any foundation to that fear of all this radiation that surrounds us?
Well, I'm not an expert. I suspect that's an exaggerated fear. That's an example of the exaggerated fear that people have about minor dangers like low radiation levels and carcinogens in food and things like that. I think people probably fret too much about the tiny, tiny risks. I mean, there has been an issue about children and mobile phones, hasn't there, as an example, but I'm not at all an expert. But I suspect that people tend to fret too much about those and fret not enough about the unfamiliar one, because I think the mantra that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable is an important guideline. Yeah.
I wonder, as an astronomer, would you like to speculate on the one way for us to get out of this place as a biological form, namely to construct a wormhole, which in principle could be done?
Yes. Well, I mean, of course, I started off by some preemptive modesty saying engineering was hard, but engineering a wormhole would be doubly hard. So I don't think so. In fact, an anecdote about that, I don't know if you saw the film Interstellar, and the scientific advice was given by a good friend of mine, Kip Thorne, who's a legal professor at Caltech, and I was invited along by the Times film critic for a preview, since it had been sold as a film of science is all right. I frankly thought that although it showed people going through a wormhole, it didn't seem to me to be all that realistic, and in fact I said to the film critic, and she quoted me in her review, that this guy going through this wormhole, it was like being on the Northern Line. You know. So I don't think that's a way out.
One more question, and then I think you must let Martin.
Two more.
Thank you,
Hi.
Mister, for your lecture. You mentioned ethical issues a number of times.
Sure.
I just wondered how you personally imbibe your ethical sense, and whether over your life and work you've worked out how to get scientists and engineers more sensitive to these sorts of issues.
Well, it's presumptuous of me to influence others. I think one is gratified by the concern that many people have about their work. But I think it's important to bear in mind that scientists have no special sensitivity in ethics. So they make discoveries, and they have an obligation, I think, to ensure that the public is engaged and is familiar. And so if you take examples where this country handle things rather well, for instance, embryo research, stem cell research and things like that, the scientists have engaged with parliamentarians and ensured that the parliamentarians at least have access to the best knowledge. But of course, when it comes to ethical decision, that should be left to the public, because the scientists have no particular superiority in their judgment in ethics. But they do have no special obligation, I think, to inform the public if there are possible ethical concerns about the kind of applications of the work they're doing. And of course, going back early on, I think the people who worked on the Manhattan Project set a good example. I was privileged to know people like Hans Bethe and Joe Rotblat, who were leaders of the Manhattan Project, and after World War II they went back to civilian life, but they remained concerned to try and harness for good the powers they'd helped unleash, and they felt it was their responsibility to work hard on this, even though they knew they'd have only limited success. So scientists have a special responsibility, but they shouldn't expect that they have a special say if it's an ethical judgment.
So, Martin,
Yes.
if I might just
Yes.
briefly interject, surely in this era of post-truth and alternative facts, scientists do have the ability and indeed the duty to say you should argue from the evidence
Sure,
and
absolutely.
make your policy
Absolutely,
based
absolutely.
on the evidence,
Absolutely.
not on some fancy will
Right.
or prejudice.
Absolutely, yes.
Now, last question.
Great.
Actually, you segue perfectly into your comment there, actually, because Martin, a wonderful lecture. Your optimism breathes through your humour, breathes through your presentation. But there's one thing I appreciate an optimistic take on. One of the most dispiriting things I think over the last 10 years or so has been the manipulation of the debate about climate change, particularly in the United States, by scientists, corporations, purposely putting out fake agendas, right, in order to make the topic needlessly complicated. Frankly. 20 years ago, Sir Richard Doll stood in the middle of that lecture theatre and said the same thing happened about the connection between cigarette smoking and lung cancer.
Yes.
And our exhibition, Passive Smoking. How do you think one could tackle this systematic perversion of public debate, when scientists can, in fact, be persuaded to join either side, given enough money?
Yes. Well, of course, we can't stop some scientists being bribed, or there's no reason why some scientists don't have rather eccentric ideas. But it's certainly true. There's a book called Merchants of Doubt, which you know, of course, which does compare the tobacco campaign and the fossil fuel campaign, and points out that some of the same people were involved in both. And in both cases, one of the techniques was to exaggerate the uncertainties. I mean, I think in climate change, because there are lots of uncertainties. We don't know how fast the temperature will rise to within a factor of 2. We don't know. So we are, in my view, going to really only do something if we are concerned to protect against the worst case. So there are uncertainties, but they're not as big as are claimed by some of the so-called deniers. And I think that was true of the tobacco people, and they tried to see doubt, but of course that was also some corruption, getting some people to sign papers they had written, and that sort of thing does happen, doesn't it?
It does.
Yes. But we must keep
But I
campaigning.
do like to think the scientific community is genuinely, usually honest, for the very simple reason that if you tell what you get found out by the guy in the next lab.
Well, indeed. I mean, of course, there has been rightly some concern about sort of fraud and poor quality data, and there is indeed some of that. But I think if we compare ourselves with other professions, law, we have no reason to be especially ashamed of ourselves.
Well, on that appropriate note, may I once again thank you, Martin, all the organic life forms in this lecture theatre have enjoyed enormously what you have to say, what you had to say. Good luck with the search for extraterrestrial life, wherever it may lurk. But meanwhile, back here on Earth, back in the Science Museum, thank you all for being with us in our wonderful new Hans Rousing lecture.
you.